I'm Jenny Gibbs, Executive Director of the IFPDA and the IFPDA Foundation. The IFPDA Foundation provides support for the programs of Print Month, including today's program with Susan Tallman. Susan Tallman, who's joining us today from Berlin, is a writer and art historian who writes elegantly and extensively on contemporary art and the history of prints. A regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, she has authored and co-authored many books and catalogs. In 2011, she co-founded the seminal journal Art in Print and served as its editor-in-chief until its demise in 2019, a passing mourned by us all. Susan has 2 books coming out this month, No Plan at All, How the Danish Print Shop of Niels Borch Jensen Redefined Artists' Prints for the Contemporary World, and The Garfields Collect, Conversations with Joanna and Leslie Garfield. She's also currently working on a catalogue raisonné of the prints of Kerry James Marshall. In a conversation with a group of curators a few months ago about Print Month, Susan was described as a rock star, a viewpoint clearly shared by the more than 300 of you who registered for today's program. As it turns out, describing Susan as a rock star is not hyperbole. And for those of you who grew up in New York City in the 80s, you might join me in a fangirl moment for the Band of Susans, of which Susan Tallman is a founding member. If you have questions, and we hope that you do, please type them into the Q&A box and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of Susan's presentation. As a reminder, today's program is being recorded, as are all the programs of Print Month, and will be available on the website of the IFPDA. I've had a peek at Susan's slides and I'm excited to see where she's taking us. It's moments like these when I wish we were together at the Javits Center, which we will be next October, so that I could say, please join me in welcoming Susan Tallman, and she could hear our applause, but this will have to do. Please join me in welcoming Susan Tallman to our Zoom.
Thanks, Jenny, for that very, very flattering introduction, and for calling me out on Band of Susans. And thanks also to Sherry for facilitating all the tech on this. I'm hoping I've got all my ducks in a row. And I also want to thank the IFPDA more broadly for having consistently put on such rewarding events under duress. And back in the days when we actually saw people face to face, for putting on what was actually a really exciting, pleasant, enjoyable fair to visit. And I say this as a person who generally finds art fairs to be miserable experiences. I've never found that to be the case at the IFPDA. So when Jenny asked me to put together this talk, it seemed like a good moment to give some thought to how and why the experience of looking at prints differs from looking at other kinds of art in a similar situation. So some years ago, I gave a talk at a conference organized by the Art School in Oslo called Printmaking in the Expanded Field. Now, the expanded field could just be a sort of punchy way of saying new techniques or diversity or other kind of happy things. But in contemporary art, the term has a very, very specific referent, which is a highly influential essay by Rosalind Krauss titled Sculpture in the Expanded Field. Writing in 1979, Krauss had found herself vexed by the sloppy fit between the way the word sculpture was being used, Brancusi, Rodin, etc., and the kinds of three-dimensional activities that she saw going on around her, like land art and installations and non-functional architectural structures. To call these kind of things sculptures, she felt, was to stretch the customary meaning of the word to the breaking point. And further, to do so in order to impose on these strange creations some kind of cozy but false familiarity. The aim of these artists was not to build on the formal inventions of Bernini or Brancusi, but to investigate things like the relationships of bodies and space and social behaviors. So in place of the old category of sculpture, Krauss posited a new taxonomy organized through what she called terms that are felt to be in opposition within a cultural situation. That's a very abstract way of putting it, but the argument goes like this. Sculpture, designed objects on plinths, could be understood as things that in our culture sat in a place that was neither architecture nor landscape. They thus occupied a field defined by exclusion. But if you place the terms landscape and architecture along with their opposites in a quadrant, the field expanded. And she devised a nifty diagram to make her point. I once attended a symposium that was entirely about this diagram. Krauss's rhombus could accommodate many of the activities and structures that she was seeing around her. The site constructions like the Mary Miss piece I just showed, Robert Smithson's spiral jetty, which is landscape yet not landscape, Gordon Matta Clark's split house, which was and was not architecture, as well as in the not architecture, not landscape corner, shaped objects on plinths. So the promise of the expanded field was that if you could identify the right set of opposing terms, any domain, however rife with haphazard experiment and new forms, could be revealed as conceptually coherent. New art had a logic, an intellectual spine that existed independent of any particular craft skills like marble carving or clay modeling. Within the situation of postmodernism, Krauss wrote, an artist's practice is not defined in relation to a given medium, but rather in relation to the logical operations on a set of cultural terms for which any medium, photography, books, lines on walls, mirrors, or sculpture itself might be used. So the question at that Oslo conference was, if art is no longer defined by medium, which terms felt to be in opposition within a cultural situation would usefully describe the activities formerly known as prints? It's a really good parlor game. You could, for example, play with the opposed terms site and distribution, a particular artwork in a specific place versus a particular artwork existing concurrently in many places. This expanded field could encompass the familiar fine art print, whose distribution facilitates private ownership and consumption in multiple locations. But it could also embrace things like swoon street works, built from woodcut parts that might be distributable, but are combined into unique site-specific installations. Or Damon Davis's All Hands on Deck project, developed in Ferguson, Missouri after the shooting of Michael Brown by police in 2014. In the midst of the anger and momentum for change, Davis began photographing the hands of people involved in the protests, printed the pictures on 3-foot-high sheets of paper, and plastered them up on boarded storefronts with the participation of store owners. The hands were raised in the familiar "don't shoot" gesture, but they also acted to affirm presence rather than abandonment, action rather than neglect. Taking distribution a step further, Davis set up a website where people could download and print the images to post in their own cities. A paper monument for the paperless is a woodcut project organized by the Dutch artist Dominique Himmelsbach de Vries that produced woodcut portraits of undocumented immigrants in Europe, making them available on request for posting in cities around the world. The portraits were cut in person and represent individual asylum seekers. The style of depiction varies from one to the next, reflecting the different hands of the 18 artists who cut the blocks. So as a strategy, it visibly mixes the intimate and specific encounter of individuals with the distribution requirements of collective action. Not all sites are outdoors, of course. Each of the prints making up Barbara Bloom's portfolio, Gifts, carries an embedded story about the nature and ambiguities of gift giving. The sheets are printed in a limited edition that can be hung like any other work of art on paper, but the portfolio box comes with multiple copies of each sheet, and the owner is encouraged to use them to wrap presents, transforming the distributed artwork into a singular object attached to a specific time, place, and personal encounter. Daniel Buren's framed Exploded Defaced, which appeared the same year as Krauss's essay in 1979, is an editioned site-specific DIY installation. Apologies for the quality of the slide. It does come from Daniel Buren's site. Beginning at the large aquatint plate of his signature stripe, each member of the edition was printed in a different color on the yellow to red spectrum, then cut into 25 squares, which were individually framed. The instructions explain that the squares have to be arranged in order in an even grid stretching across the full wall. If there are any obstructions where one of them should go, as for instance in the upper right, those pieces of the 25 have to be put away for the duration of the installation. This kind of site specificity, which gained traction as an art strategy in the 60s and 70s, can be seen, much like pop art, as a response to the profusion of printed reproductions in the world. It seeks to remind us that every object is embedded in a larger context and that reproduction catches only a portion of its meaning. If we define the art experience in terms of the relationship between an object and its setting in time and space, then everything becomes unique, regardless how many copies exist in the world. No body of work articulates the duality of site and distribution as clearly as Felix Gonzalez Torres's stack pieces, each one simultaneously a unique sculpture sitting in one place and a limitless edition spreading around the world. Public and private, intimate and shared. There are other possible terms. One might also think about singularity and sequence. Here, the traditional position, the equivalent of sculptures on plinths, would be occupied by the standard limited edition, a group of things that all look the same and purposefully do not progress apart from the penciled numerator in the edition number. The ontological complications of this situation, things that are the same yet not the same, has kept Jasper Johns engaged with prints for more than half a century, beginning with the great 0 through 9 portfolios. The 10 lithographs marched through the digits, but all were pulled from the same stone printed in succession, with partial reworking between the editioning of each numeral. Further, each state of the stone was printed in 3 different editions, one in black, one in gray, and one in colors, as a sort of fractal enhancement of the plurality endemic in print. For conceptual artists like Sol LeWitt, the mechanics of print production provided a natural means for stepping through the permutations of a given set of variables. You can make a plate, print it, turn it, print it again, add another plate, print that, so on and so forth. The portfolio format furthermore made it possible to keep all these variants equally present, repudiating the hierarchical idea of a single, final, or preferred outcome or right answer. In her portfolio of 30 screen prints on a clear day, Agnes Martin was not setting out to demonstrate the execution of an a priori premise. Instead, Martin found her way intuitively and responsively, working within the possibilities of the grid, seeking emotional resonance through the finely tuned relationship of parts, both within each print and between them. And sequences can also, of course, be used to tell a story, as in David Hockney's Rake's Progress. As a whole, the set offers a kind of Bildungsroman following the artist's adventure on his first trip to the United States. But every image in the set can also work as a compositionally self-sufficient entity. You might benefit from seeing them all, but you would not feel lost viewing just one. The serial print is also the natural precursor of motion pictures, of course, as many artists have noticed. Christiane Baumgartner, who did video work as a young artist, shifted to woodcut with the 25-part series Eine Sekunde, in which each print replicates a frame from a 1-second snippet of video shot out a car window. And Tacita Dean's large photogravure projects, this is her most recent, mix found photographic material and hand annotations in a mode that parallels the manipulations of film, where she intervenes by manually masking within the camera at the time of shooting. The gravure's sequenced frames invoke film, time, and motion, but also the experience of teetering on the border between control and dissolution. And Kerry James Marshall's 48-foot-long, 8-foot-tall color woodcut, which, by the way, he printed himself, can be seen as a long cinematic pan, moving from the exterior of a building through the walls into a comfortable living room where young men sit around drinking coffee before continuing down the hall and past the open door of a neatly made-up bedroom. The grandeur of the presentation ennobles what should be a fairly quotidian subject of young Black men who are neither victims nor perps. More broadly still, we might consider the opposed terms context and fragment, since the idea of reality as an accretion of incidental parts is a core piece of postmodernism. This quality is literally built into prints, whose logistics depend on the transfer of an image from one surface to another, and on the strategic compilation of that image in discrete stages, from different plates, different blocks, different stencils, color separations, whatever. And this context fragment relationship may be quite subtle, present as a kind of elegant organizational principle. So in these prints, Jane Kent on the left, Martin Puryear on the right, the images are coherent, but each is composed of clearly distinct parts. As viewers, we have a sense of things having arrived there from different places at different times by different methods, coming together, but more like guests at a well-executed cocktail party than like, say, walls in a building. Anselm Kiefer, on the other hand, dramatized the action and chanciness of accumulation in the early print paintings that he built from myriad individual woodcuts he'd made of faces, logs, fires, trees. The paint that was applied over top creates this unifying web, but the selection of parts remains visibly variable. More recently, William Kentridge's Universal Archive used encyclopedia pages as a seemingly makeshift substrate for his lino cuts, suggesting both the aspirational cohesion and actual friability of our attempts to comprehend the world. The context fragmentation vector can also point in the opposite direction, away from accretion and towards dispersal. Running with that metaphor, Carlos Amarales's useless wonder maps breaks nation states into printing plates whose relocation and reorientation upends any cozy illusions of geopolitical stability or cartographic coherence. Context and fragment also provides a natural home for that quintessential postmodern form, the artist's book, designed to be experienced in bits, though configured in the mind as a unit. Ed Ruscha's famous 26 gasoline station still stands as the archetype of a work composed to illuminate the poetics of the literal elliptical juncture. And finally, the pursuit of fragment context romances has fostered a breadth of what we might call paraprint formats, like Robin Vart's arrangements of bound books that spell out messages through the publisher logos on their spines. This one says, "I love you too." But the single most obvious opposing terms for thinking about the contemporary print would have to be uniqueness and reproducibility, especially when we recognize that not uniqueness is essentially multiplicity and not reproducibility merges into the ever fuzzy notion of originality. This is the heart of contemporary printmaking, the stuff and substance of the vaunted print renaissance of the 1960s, the foundry of our canon. Its expanded field is tailor-made to Johns's profound investigations of identity and difference in all their emotional, cognitive, and moral implications. It also gives space to pop art's reconfiguring of mass market imagery and the visual syntax of reproduction, dot screens, line blocks, color separations, registration errors, etc. It accommodates Richard Hamilton's creative dismantling of cultural and visual artifacts of mass media, and also Glenn Ligon's transference of the accreted errors endemic in cheap reproduction like photocopying to the tonier housing of etching, where they acquire a fixed tactility and where ink on paper, black on white, black on black, act as metaphors for race and social visibility. But the reproduction uniqueness field can further house works like Via Selman's hand-cut wood engravings of ocean surfaces, small miracles of attentiveness where reproduction is a cognitive and manual action rather than a job to be outsourced to a machine, and uniqueness is embedded in every mark. Finally, this expanded field gives space to prints that employ processes developed for reproduction, but that abjure the possibility of multiplicity. Prints like Kate McCrickard's monotypes, for which she draws a line on paper laid over an inked plate, after which the process is repeated with colors, each applied to the plate one at a time, using pressure from a stylus or from her fingers to transfer tone and line. The reversal in indirection is printerly, but the image is unrepeatable. Carrie James Marshall's African Powers prints from the late 1980s were developed as an exercise in improvisation. Using a small Morgan linoscribe tabletop relief press, originally marketed to shopkeepers so they could make signs that said things like men's ties 50% off, he first applied oil paint to a plexiglass plate and ran it through the press. Then, responding to the resulting color fields, he would cut a wood block from found lumber and print it over the monotype, reversing the more familiar hand-colored woodcut order of operations. In fact, Krauss herself introduces uniqueness and reproducibility toward the end of her essay, where she offers it up as a way of understanding the postmodern space, not of prints, but of painting. This touches on what is, for those of us who love prints, kind of a sore point: the seemingly endless overlooking of prints in deference to painting. So while the expanded field may sound like a jolly enough open play place, geographically speaking, one person's expansion is someone else's encroachment. And pronouncing the fertile territory of uniqueness and reproduction to be the province of painting could well strike print people as painting stepping up to the podium, elbowing printmaking out of the way, and delivering the kick-ass speech that printmaking wrote. And yet, Krauss is not wrong. Since that late 50s, early 60s watershed, when modernism slid into postmodernism, painters have been preoccupied with the nature and substance of identity, originality, and replication. Warhol is the obvious poster boy for this theme, but Rauschenberg was there before him, exploring the collision of handmade mark and reproduction, of borrowing and making and adapting and appropriating. From the moment that Johns had his prophetic dream of painting an American flag, his work has braided replication and origination. By the way, it is worth reading carefully the medium descriptions on the labels in the current Johns retrospectives at the Whitney and in Philadelphia to see just how many of his paintings and drawings were created over a base of printed matter that he either made or found. Via Selman's handmade replicas of found slates with their uncanny fidelity to the incidental are also part of this conversation, prodding us to consider replication and uniqueness not just as byproducts of mechanized production, but as products of human action. Reproducibility and uniqueness also found their way into paintings that pushed out into architecture, like Jennifer Bartlett's pivotal installation Rhapsody. The description of Wade Guyton's inkjets on linens as painting has caused some consternation among some print people. There is certainly something printerly about his staging of idea, template, and output, but he came to the process from a conceptual art position. He feels incompetent as a printmaker because he doesn't have the background or the historical knowledge, and his use of an inkjet printer arose from his desire to make something using materials at hand in his studio, and like everybody else, he owned a computer and a printer. His first layouts were done in Microsoft Word. However, the pigment gets onto the gessoed fabric, it does get there. And when you stand in front of them, Guyton's pictures feel more like paintings than like prints, thanks to their scale and materials. This topic shows no particular sign of petering out. Witness Lorna Simpson's recent screen-printed canvases, which, like Rauschenberg's 60 years ago, navigate between the found, the printed, and the painted. All of these works pull ideas that are fundamental to print, repeatability, distribution, fragmentation, seriality, into the materiality and social space of painting, where, let's be honest, we look at them differently. Among biologists and paleontologists, there's an ongoing argument about how tightly species should be defined. Where in the spectrum from teacup Yorkie to wolfhound to wolf do you draw the line? On one side, you have the lumpers, who argue that a given species designation should be able to accommodate a good degree of variation. On the other side, you have the splitters, who are willing to accept a heftier taxonomic table as a fair trade for greater precision of description. If the natural sciences can't come to a unified position on such points, it seems unlikely that artists, curators, collectors, and critics will be able to do so. I have long argued that prints should not be considered as a category at all, but as a spectrum, with something like a Via Selman's woodcut at one end and something like Guyton's inkjets at the other. And this is what Krauss's expanded field seems to offer. Taking her uniqueness reproducibility pairing, we find space for unique printed reproductions, for paintings that repeat themselves, for those that combine printed matter and hand facture. But down at the bottom, where, following her sculpture example, we expect to find traditional painting, we have the convergence of multiplicity and originality. In other words, the original print. So either the print has been subsumed and a subset of painting, and in the historical null position of painting at that, or painting should be considered a subset of print. Certainly, The last half century of debates about uniqueness and reproduction in art have been loudest in painting, in part because of its unparalleled economic heft, but also because the ideas were new there. Remember that the original problem the expanded field was supposed to solve was the mismatch between old terms and new ways of working. How to think about, understand, and describe the art made after the paradigm shift that prompted artists to stop carving wood and start carving deserts. So the presumption when we talk about an expanded field of prints is that in prints also there exists some fundamental discontinuity between historic modes of making and meaning and our present ones. But all those shiny postmodern ideas about man-machine interdependence, identity and replication, site specificity and unregulated travel, the fragmentary nature of experience have always been there in prints. They were built into prints from the time paper first kissed printing matrix hello and goodbye. And beyond the initiating polyamory of paper and template, impression and edition, we know that artists, printers, publishers, and collectors have long played with the possibilities of separation and reconfiguration, tuning and retuning the tension between belonging and independence. They built compound images from multiple blocks in ways that were modest, as in John Foster's portrait of Richard Mather, the earliest known print to be made in North America, and ways that were ambitious, as in the famous Bavaria aerial map of Venice. Printed on 36 sheets of paper from 195 individual blocks, Albrecht Dürer's triumphal arch Maximilian was a paper monument 500 years before the paper monument for the paperless. It was meant to reinforce the awesome power of the emperor, not to give faces to the dispossessed, but distribution was understood in both cases as an instrument of power. In Japan, also, coherent compositions were broken across multiple sheets. And wherever there were prints, there were print series and sequences. Japanese publishers churned out series on landscape, celebrities, travel, battles, and weird foreigners. European publishers churned out print series on Platonic solids, the 4 seasons, the 7 deadly sins, the 10 labors of Hercules, an endless number of fish, and weird foreigners. Meanwhile, printed narrative sequences constitute much of the Western art historical canon. There's Dürer's Apocalypse, Caillots's Miseries of War, Goya's Capriccios and Disasters of War, Piranesi's Views of Rome, and the original Hogarth Rake's Progress. When John James Audubon started on Birds of America, his goal was the depiction of every species of bird on the continent. 18 years and 435 plates later, he had completed one of the greatest pictorial series of all time, though he had only covered about half the continent's avians. And at the height of modernism, the serial form served to elucidate the inner workings of the artist's eye and mind. 15 years before Johns's 0 through 9, Picasso's Bull series used progressive states of a stone to animate the artist's protean reconfiguration of form. But like accumulation, fragmentation was an ever-present option. And for all that most art history books will tell you that collage was invented by Picasso and Braque in the early 20th century, people had been cutting and pasting printed matter pretty much as long as there was printed matter to cut and paste. This is the Chinese drawing room at Temple Newsome House, where Lady Hertford chose to augment the exotic wallpaper given to her by the Prince of Wales with flying birds cut from her copy of Birds of America. For centuries, prints were cut up, colored in, glued to walls, furniture, globes, dressed in fabric, fragmented, recontextualized, distributed, and made site-specific. Painter printmakers like Hercules Zeckers mixed techniques designed for replication with those that were improvisational and unrepeatable. Then, as now, print processes offered people a way of thinking and working that differed from the direct application of pigment to a surface. From the Renaissance onward, paintings have aspired to provide self-sufficient universes, a fiction so tidily composed we don't worry about what is happening off stage. We stand in front of them, we look at them one at a time, we walk into the frame. But the print room is a place where you group and collect things that are busy pointing to other things, to other members in the series, to other versions of the subject, to other impressions from its plate, or just from the ink on paper image to the template that made it. A print is almost always a node within a network. And all the opposed terms we've just discussed, site and distribution, singularity and sequence, context and fragment, uniqueness and reproducibility, all of them are really just ways of talking about the simple, mind-bending fact that one inimitable thing may leave a multitude of traces that are and are not part of the thing that gave rise to them. Prints did not need an expanded field to become postmodern. If there was a paradigm shift for prints, it came a century earlier, with the partitioning of the original print away from the reproductive print and the sidelining of handmade prints as an economic force. As a land grab, it pushed in the opposite direction, with the 19th century etching revival laying claim to parts of painting's territory. Since then, prints were just waiting for everybody else to catch up. And this may be why, at the IFPDA Fine Print Fair, the 21st century and the 16th century can rub shoulders and have productive conversations that you don't often see in contemporary art fairs. It may be why in prints, scholars like Richard Field can stretch their expertise across the centuries, from the very first European woodblocks to the works of Jasper Johns and Christiana Baumgartner, and make important contributions at both ends. But there is something more that needs to be said here. In 1979, it was probably helpful to propose that one might organize things along conceptual rather than material lines. But in becoming the dominant way we talk about and evaluate contemporary art, this approach has quashed, or at least sidelined, other equally important aspects of how art is made and operates in the world. To put it simply, many, probably most artists, do not operate in the rigorously logical progression that Krauss envisaged through terms felt to be in opposition in a particular cultural situation. They spend time not only thinking, but making, and those activities are rarely neatly separable. Making is a responsive process, dependent on the interaction of variables like muscle memory, chemistry, humidity, available resources, personality quirks, and somewhere in there, an instigating idea. Talking about the origins of representational art, the 20th century art historian Ernst Gombrich argued that making comes before matching. In the 21st century, we should remind ourselves that making can also come before meaning, or at least walk with it hand in hand. People are thinkers, but we are also tinkerers. We look at what we've made with an analytical eye, and sometimes we find meanings or mysteries that lead us forward to the next bit of tinkering. So while the expanded field parlor game is a helpful reminder of the conceptual sophistication that flows in and out of things along the print spectrum, we should not forget that printing is also a visceral expression of presence and contact, and that indexical presence has never ceased to have power in art, whether the template is a 40,000-year-old hand on a wall in Indonesia, or the hands of a man and his monkey, Darwin and Huxley could not have asked for more, or the artist's own body used as a template marking the intersection of the corporeal and the political, or inadvertent traces left at bus stops and picked up by forensic fingerprint powder. Most prints, of course, are not made from body parts. Most prints are contrived devices, but those devices are also rooted in the corporeal world. Christiana Baumgartner's move from video to woodcut and her decision to cut the image in the form of scan lines was conceptually extremely elegant. But as anyone who has seen her work in person knows, what holds you in place is the loop between the palpable property of the woodblock, the kinesthetic sense of the strength and control of the cutting, and the perception of a mind responding to both an a priori plan and the exigencies of what happens in the moment-to-moment working. Speaking at that Oslo conference on printmaking in the expanded field, Andrew Raftery brought the house down by talking in direct terms about his experience of engraving. Engraving, he said, allowed him to hone his sense of line and encouraged his impulse to build images incrementally through the accretion of small marks. The study of drawing and painting provided useful tools for structuring a picture and developing the spatial envelope that could contain his content. The combination of crafting and picture making was, he remarked, extremely satisfying. It is easy enough to situate an image like this, part of a semi-filmic series moving through a real estate open house, in the expanded field of postmodernism. But to leave it at that would be to miss the baseline miracle of the image itself. Perhaps the most important shift for prints since 1960 has been the profusion of talented printers and the acceptance of a woolly notion of collaboration. It's a development that suits Krauss's expanded field notion of postmodern artistic practice as no longer defined in relation to a given medium, but in relation to the logical operations of a set of cultural terms, which may be medium, photography, books, lines on walls, mirrors, etc. What remains unacknowledged is that the same instigating idea can give rise to a great print or a lame one. Collaboration is usually thought of as the artist outsourcing certain production skills, but we all know it can also be a printer outsourcing an instigating idea. Most of the time, it's neither or both. A push-pull of technical and conceptual experimentation, of looking and tweaking, talking and thinking, chemistry, catastrophe, and creative resilience. Things that happen on the ground as much as in the brain. The essential problem with the expanded field, it seems to me, is that it was laid out by a surveyor, not by a farmer. Surveyors scan acreage as an abstraction. Farmers may do that, but they also have to deal with dirt and drainage and, as James C. Scott wrote in Seeing Like a State, telling a farmer only that he is leasing 20 acres of land is about as helpful as telling a scholar that he has bought 6 kilograms of books. Thank you very much.
That was amazing. I'm so glad that we recorded that because I know I'm going to go back and spend more time with it and with those amazing slides. Opening up the floor to questions. I can see we have a lot of folks who are more erudite than myself on the program. So if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box. I wanted to open with a question that's actually sort of more personal, or a question about your own professional trajectory. With someone with the intellectual firepower to take on anything in the art historical canon, when and how and why did you focus on the printed image? And have you ever encountered any pushback to that as a fitting subject for your interest?
Oh, I don't think it's pushback. I think it's just, you know, a lot of people are not particularly interested, right? It's not like anybody tells you don't do it. It's just, yeah, it is definitely seen as a niche thing. And I did my undergrad work at Wesleyan, which has a great print collection, and Dickfield did the Jasper Johns show there when I was a student, and it was, you know, this sort of transformative event. And then in graduate school at Columbia, I got interested in, this is going to sound like so geeky, I was doing 19th century American painting was what I was doing my graduate work on. And I got interested in what painters on this side of the Atlantic were actually looking at, because there weren't a lot of paintings for them to look at. And what they were looking at were all these printed reproductions and these how-to books. And so that was intriguing, like where that slippage takes place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just thinking back to, I mean, this is dating, but thinking back to taking art history classes with those boxes of the black and white prints that we got.
Oh yeah. We
had the intertubes. We have, it's more of a comment than a question, but I thought that it was worth sharing from Marianne Simmons, letting us know about Damon Davis's All Hands on Deck.
Mm-hmm.
Damon Davis's All Hands on Deck was formalized in, can't read the whole thing, placing them in places that need this inclusive message. This week, a set is being proposed for a corporate lobby. From the boarded, from the boarded up windows in Ferguson to museums, private homes, and perhaps a corporate lobby. From the pages of art and print to walls throughout America. Thank you. So that is a lovely.
Yeah, that's great.
Other questions from anyone who's on the program, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A box. I wanted to circle back to a conversation that we were having before we started, sort of my fixation. There was this wonderful exhibit at the Met a couple of years ago, Relative Value, and it was in, I think it was in the court of the Lehman wing.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and sort of valuing works in cows, which I thought was a wonderful unit of measure.
Mm-hmm.
And basically showing us that the valuations in the medieval times were based on the intrinsic value of the material and also durability. Do you think that we're still a little bit stuck in looking at works on paper somehow as having less intrinsic value, and do you think that impacts this conversation at an intellectual level?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some irony in the fact that Marxist art historians love to talk about painting. I think there is a sense in which prints are still are eternally considered a byproduct of something else, as opposed to something primary. You know, part of my interest, so I'm a member of Print Council of America. There was a meeting in San Francisco. We all go to Palace of the Legion of Honor. We walk into this room where there are these like grand, huge paintings, and off in the corner, there's something that's like 8 by 10 inches in black and white, and we all make a beeline for that, right? So some of this is just personal preference. Like I like black and white. I like small. So, you know, some of it just has to do with that kind of thing. But I also think you can be interested in something that has a lot of singular clout, or you can be interested in something that has this more diffuse social behavior. And art history has tended to concentrate on things that have kind of singular clout rather than the diffuse behavior. But I actually think the big problem for prints these days is glass. I think we all spend all our time looking at pictures behind shiny pieces of plastic. And if we could solve the glass problem,
Yeah.
it would be a big help.
That is such an interesting point. And it's one of the reasons why in 2019, we were very keen at the IFPD to have Swoon create that installation, this
Right.
wall to get outside the frame and get away from the glass. I'm reminded by Nadine Orenstein that relative value is still on view at the Met, which is great. I encourage anyone who hasn't seen that exhibition to see it. It is eye-opening. Lots of good questions coming in now. Holly Morrison is wondering, Kentridge's films, when viewed by an etcher, seem to have their roots in the process of state proofing. Do you have any knowledge as to whether etching and state proofing were influential in his moving to animation?
Kate McCrickard would be the person to ask. I don't know, because he also, so many of those early films also used the torn paper that comes and then he runs it backwards and forwards and it coalesces and comes out. But I wouldn't be, I mean, it's such a natural connection between state proofing and he does the charcoal drawings where he erases, you know, I'm not sure. There's a lot of interconnectedness there, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Got it. Yasmin Canavan has a question. Your talk mentioned, quote, stretching the meaning to a breaking point for sculpture. Is there a breaking point for describing an artwork as print, and what might that be? That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question, because of course I weasel out of answering it by saying it's a spectrum without stating where the spectrum ends. Yeah, I think there are probably things that shouldn't be called print, but I very rarely found something that an artist has called a print that I would say, no, it's not. I think that, you know, there are all kinds of qualities in addition to sort of the conceptual ones discussed today. You know, there are material qualities having to do with syntax and transference and reversal and all of those kinds of things that make things pretty. I think there are also, like there used to be a whole thing, still goes on, of talking about the painterly print, monotypes and so on. And I always wanted to do a show of the printerly painting. Are paintings that aren't necessarily screen printed or anything, but just have that sort of thinking where things are broken apart and then brought back together in ways that are kind of counterintuitive, things that are layered, that are flat. I mean, Julie Moretu, case in point, those are printerly paintings, even when there's no printing on them.
Right. Love that. Question, which I think is a good segue from that. I wonder if you can speak to the relationship between print and drawing. You spoke about painting and the traditional hierarchy of art mediums. In many ways, drawing fits somewhere in between prints and drawings on the scale, as small ephemeral works that live in study rooms, but still original and creations. Monotypes often are seen as fitting more with drawings or paintings than prints due to these qualities. So I pose the question about hierarchy.
Yeah. I mean, drawings definitely get more cred than prints in, and have done for, and somebody's going to catch me out on this because I'm going to get the date wrong, but I'm going to say, you know, since the 18th century, 17th century, because for a long time, nobody cared about working drawings, right? Working drawings were just like a stage on the way to something else. Prints, on the other hand, were finished works of art. So if what you cared about was the finished image, the print could be seen as more meaningful than the drawing. But then we got very, very interested in like what was going on in the artist's head. And we wanted to get closer and closer and closer and closer to the hand and the mind and the eye and the process. And you don't usually get that from prints because there's just so many steps in between. And even something like the Kate McCrickard monotypes or Carrie's monotypes, are purposefully kind of removed from the immediacy of direct drawing. They're using that sort of little double step to take you away. So yeah, I think most people would value drawings more highly than prints.
Well, we don't like that answer, but I'll take it.
Just means there's work to do, Jenny.
That's right. We have many love letters from subscribers of Art and Print. Shepard says, I was a subscriber to Art and Print and I was sad when it was discontinued. Any chance it will be revived? If no, can you recommend an alternative for a printmaker and art history graduate?
Well, yes. No, short of some billionaire deciding that he or she desperately wants to throw money at a money-losing venture. No.
There might be one or two on the Zoom. You never know.
There might be one or two on the Zoom. You know how to reach me. But, you know, the audience is very small. And the problem is that the audience is small but passionate. But it's just kind of untenable as or at least the way we did it was untenable. I'm not saying that somebody else can't come up with a better plan that would really work. There isn't a lot else out there. You know, there's Print Quarterly, which does a great job on the historical and scholarly end of things. And then there are, you know, various print maker organizations with their publications. But yeah, it's a real hole. And the main reason we started it was not because we thought that there should really be a ghettoized print publication, but because the mainstream magazines just would not publish things. It had the word print in it. You had to couch it in some other way, right? You could write about prints, but just call them prints. And that seemed silly.
Right. Yeah. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour. You kindly shared with us an etching by Andrew Raftery, and I would be remiss if I did not point out that Andrew Raftery will be speaking with us on Thursday this week with Jennifer Roberts, Glenn Adamson, narrated in a talk moderated by Shelley Langdale from the National Gallery. And tomorrow we have Gordon Samuel and biographer Jenny Uglow. She will be sharing some new material from her forthcoming book, Sybil and Cyril, Cutting Through Time, which explores the relationship between Sybil Andrews and Cyril Power. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. Thank you for your excellent questions. Thank you for hanging with us through Print Month. And we'll see you tomorrow. Take care. Bye.